Welcome to the Alliance's Roundtable event today. I'd like to welcome you all and introduce Beth Hamilton. Beth has been a leader in the anti-sexual violence movement throughout the state of Connecticut, including on our state's college campuses through policy work and in collaboration with our campus and community partners. It's been my absolute honor to work alongside her and learn from her in my time so far at the Alliance, and I'm so very thankful that she'll be starting out our program today. So with that, go right ahead, Beth.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Bridget. And thank you so much. I'm very excited. There's many of you I have not seen in quite a while. So I appreciate seeing you. For a brief moment, I saw some of you live, and now I'm seeing some of your pictures and your names. So I'm so delighted to be here and to welcome you this morning to our Title IX Roundtable. Many of you are longstanding partners, decades-long partners of the Alliance. And so I'm happy especially that those of you can join us. As Bridget mentioned, my name is Beth Hamilton. I'm the Executive Director here at the Connecticut Alliance to End Sexual Violence. So we're going to be joined today throughout the morning by a number of advocates, experts, and policymakers as we spend some time exploring the history and future of our response to sexual violence at our colleges and universities. For many years, Connecticut has been a national leader in its response to campus sexual assault, and we strongly believe that this is because of our strong leadership and collaborative approach that we take to policymaking here. So I want to start out this morning by thanking Senator Will Haskell, who I saw join just a few minutes ago, for sharing his time and perspective with us today. From the moment that he took office 2 years ago, Senator Haskell has been a true ally and advocate for the rights of survivors. Last session, he was able to garner bipartisan support for the campus climate bill and readily welcomed conversations with student survivors to learn more about how sexual violence personally impacted them. It's this kind of collaboration between survivors and policymakers that has truly bolstered Connecticut's response to sexual violence. I also want to extend thanks to Elizabeth Conklin, who recently transitioned from her role at the University of Connecticut to the, and I'm going to hope I get this right, Elizabeth, the Associate Vice President for Institutional Equity, Access, and Belonging at Yale University. And Elizabeth has worked with the Alliance for just about as long as I have. Elizabeth has been critical in leading the way for institutions to be invested in centering the needs of survivors and campus-based response to addressing sexual violence and preventing sexual violence. And she also created space for Title IX coordinators to collaborate and share best practices when navigating complex, multi-layered responses to sexual misconduct on their campuses. I also want to acknowledge and thank the panelists who we'll hear from a little bit later this morning. Raina, Ebony, and Jessica joined us a couple of years ago at UConn School of Law for a conference about institutional obligations and balancing that with the needs of survivors. And it was truly one of the most honest and nuanced conversations around Title IX response that I have heard administrators engage in. So it is very clear to me that these are folks who are invested in students and their campus communities, and we're delighted to have them back. I also want to thank Sarah Chipman from UConn's. She works now at the Office of Institutional Equity, and I want to thank her for joining us this morning. She'll surely enrich the panel. Finally, I want to extend my gratitude for to each of you, for joining the Alliance team this morning. But I also want to recognize that the Title IX regulations came at a time when campuses were struggling with responding to an unprecedented global pandemic. So you all really had your hands full and were quite busy thinking about student safety and navigating space. And were you going online or staying in person? And we were so impressed with the ways that institutions stepped up and leaned into continuing to review their policies, prioritizing and addressing sexual violence, even under the most challenging of circumstances. I can say, so I've been at the Alliance for almost 12 years now, which is a really long time, which is how I know so many of you. And over that time, I have seen firsthand the ways that our culture has shifted in its understanding of what sexual violence on campus looks like. And we have paid a lot more attention to the lasting impacts that sexual violence has on student survivors. However, doing this work, as I continue to do, I am reminded every single day that we have further to go. As we look to the future, we are very optimistic that a new Secretary of Education will move forward restoring the rights of students across the nation, from trans students to those struggling with predatory student loan debts to upholding the rights of survivors on campuses. However, we were so thankful that during this time, we also had longstanding history of being a leader in our approach to policies related to sexual violence on our college and university campuses. In 2014, the Alliance led efforts to pass some of the strongest legislation in the nation by bolstering and expanding on our 2012 legislation pertaining to the response to and prevention of sexual violence on Connecticut campuses. Standardized and transparent policies, training, and support for survivors all became required by law here in our state. In 2016, we took another step forward and required affirmative consent definitions to be adopted by institutions, which further shift cultures and provide clarity about appropriate consent standards. Last legislative session, the Alliance helped to coordinate efforts in support of the Campus Climate Bill, which will enable the state to measure the efficacy of its efforts over the past decade with all those policy changes I just talked about by giving students the opportunity to reflect on and share their impressions of campus climate and the campus's response to sexual misconduct. We truly look forward to working with all of you, continuing to work with our allies and our partners this session, albeit from a safe distance, because we know we will not be near the legislative office building. But we're also hoping that this today, right, starts the start of some connection and provide some opportunity for networking and connection, right, at a time when we all feel extremely isolated. So finally, said a lot. I want to turn it over to Bridget. But before I do, I want to pause and thank Bridget for her outstanding work, not just for the outstanding work you're going to see her do this morning, but for all the behind the scenes work that Bridget has done to make this roundtable possible and to make us successful. Bridget is a dedicated advocate. She's a critical thinker. She has thoughtful approaches to the work that she does, which have only enriched the relationships that we have with our campus partners and has enriched the support that we will be able to provide to student survivors. Bridget is a delight to work with, and she is the reason, again, we're going to have such a successful and rich morning together. So without that, I want to, with that, excuse me, I want to thank Bridget and the rest of our Alliance team. Again, remind folks that we will be having questions through the chat. We will pause for opportunities for folks to ask questions throughout the morning. So please know that we will get to all of those pieces as we move forward. So with that, I will turn it over to Bridget to lead us through the day.
Thank you so much, Beth, for your introduction and for your kind words. I truly appreciate it. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Bridget Kessner, and I am the Campus Services Coordinator here at the Alliance. It is my role to provide training and technical assistance to our campus community statewide. Like many of you, I've spent a great deal of time over the last several months learning all that I can about the final Title IX regulations and examining the ways that we can continue to protect the rights and well-being of survivors despite any challenges those rules may present. Before we get started on our first panel today, I'd just like to share a brief overview of the timeline of the current regulations, an explanation of a few of those rules, just to kind of give an overview, and a little bit about what that means for us here in Connecticut. So with that, I'll share my screen. All right. So once again, I'd like to welcome you all to today's event. We're hosting this roundtable today because we believed the challenges of the new Title IX rule, given those challenges, it would be helpful if we had an opportunity to collaborate regarding what trends we're seeing and what best practices we are applying to campus communities through our state. We are all working to ensure that these processes are equitable, protect the civil rights of survivors of sexual violence, and protect and address discrimination in educational environments. Here in Connecticut, we have the benefit of being a leader in this work. Between strong state laws and the application of those best practices, we are definitely uniquely positioned to respond to these rules in a way that will continue to maintain protections for those on college and university campuses in our state. So to preface our conversation, let's start with how we got here. So in November of 2018, the rules were proposed and they were controversial from the start. There was significant public response and backlash based on the impact these rules could potentially have on survivors of sexual violence and school communities if they were implemented as proposed. In fact, there were over 100,000 comments that were submitted for review, mostly arguing against those proposed regulations. The regulations were introduced in response to Obama-era guidance that intended to protect survivor rights that had been historically overlooked nationally, and it looked to create a safe and equitable process for all parties involved. However, these new regulations rolled back a lot of that guidance, and former guidance had actually been retracted by the department. The final rules were released May 22nd of 2020, despite both the public response that we saw and the challenges that were presented by the COVID-19 pandemic. This was a 2,033-page document that was implemented on August 14th of 2020. It does have the force of law, and these were voluntary actions that were taken by the Department of Education. So there was no reason that they necessarily needed to be implemented at that time or with such a short time frame for implementation. So a little bit about these rules, just to give folks a brief overview if you're a little less familiar. I want to preface this all to say that these rules only apply to actual Title IX cases and not other campus misconduct cases. We know that misconduct policies may continue to support survivors depending on what those institutions' policies look like. So really, we're talking about Title IX cases themselves through these rules. First of all, the department implemented a harmful and restrictive definition of sexual harassment, so fewer cases would be recognized under the department's rule. Institutions are mandated to dismiss Title IX complaints that did not take place within their program or activity or where the institution exercised what they call substantial control. A case may be dismissed if either party is no longer attempting to participate in a program or activity of the institution. The final rule designates fewer responsible employees. So there are fewer employees on campus that a student, could potentially report to that would initiate, that formal report. The department dropped the 60-day time frame in which cases must be addressed as well. And that was replaced by what the department called a reasonably prompt time frame. The rule requires that a presumption of innocence for the accused be provided in any case, which could potentially perpetuate harmful rape myths, especially given that the presumption of innocence is not applied to other types of campus misconduct. The rule requires survivors who go through this formal case to undergo a live cross-examination by an advisor for the accused. The rule allows for the clear and convincing standard of evidence over the more equitable preponderance of evidence standard. It allows for the use of informal resolutions, which could include mediations that would be potentially harmful and re-traumatizing for survivors while reducing the accountability of perpetrators. Though we recognize that there are appropriate informal resolutions, the department used some language that would not be appropriately applied to these cases. Additionally, the rule allows for religious exemptions that may negatively impact survivors, including LGBTQ students and pregnant or parenting students. So given all of that information, what about Connecticut and what now? Well, we recognize that these rules formalize the Title IX process. Many survivors who we work with report to institutions rather than go through a criminal case because they do not want to go through a formal process in court. This can create a chilling effect in reporting on campuses if a case is so formalized. Additionally, survivors may feel pressured into informal resolutions, not because they wish to go through that process, but because they do not want to undergo formalities such as a cross-examination. We also recognize, of course, that fewer cases will fall under Title IX. However, in some of these cases of discretionary or mandatory dismissal, there are actions that institutions can take under their own misconduct policies to address the incident of sexual violence that occurred. This can ensure that the survivor has recourse and support, and that the communities that they are in are protected. Additionally, Connecticut continues to be a leader in the country in regards to ensuring that everybody has access to safe and equitable responses to sexual violence on campus. When the new regulations were announced proposed in December of 2018, the Higher Education and Employment Committee legislated that a task force would be convened to look at how the new regulations, once adopted, would affect Connecticut's current policies and practices. Additionally, state laws will continue to protect survivors in campus communities in several ways, which we'll discuss in further panels today. And then lastly, our state's campuses have really risen to the challenge of implementing these additional policies to ensure that school community members still have access to safe and equitable educational environments. It's also critically important to mention that there are incredible community resources that are available to survivors of sexual violence to help them navigate through any sort of confusion, fear, or trauma that they may be undergoing, including advocates and attorneys. So we will be hearing about these laws, these practices, and hearing from folks who actually work for these resources during our roundtable today. If you have any questions during our panels, please feel free to put them in the chat. As Beth mentioned earlier, we will have time for an audience Q&A at the conclusion of each panel. My colleagues Jesse and Ruth will be fielding your questions today. So with that, just ending my screen share. We will be starting with a panel that is moderated by Lucy Nolan, our Director of Policy and Public Relations. Lucy is a knowledgeable and dedicated advocate and plays a critical role at the Alliance as we work toward creating and sustaining laws that prevent sexual violence and protect survivors. Given the absolutely incredible work that Lucy does leading the Alliance's policy efforts, she was the clear choice to moderate this panel today. With that, I'll hand it over to her. Welcome, Lucy.
Thank you, Bridget. I also want to welcome Senator Will Haskell and Elizabeth Conklin, if we can get them pinned here. There we go. And Bridget will be staying. Hi, there we are. Thank you. You need to unmute yourself, please. Since I muted you, I guess I take away my power to unmute you. I can mute you, but I can't unmute you. Sort of a parent's dream, right? I just wanted to start today, and thank you all for coming, and Bridget, thank you for that great recap. This has been, I just want to say for Bridget that she's really my go-to person when I have any questions about Title IX, and she really is just so well-versed, as many of you know who work with her. I want to introduce our panelist today. Senator Will Haskell wears many hats at the legislature. He's a Deputy President Pro Tem, Chair of the Higher Education and Employment and Advancement Committee, Vice Chair of the Government Administration and Elections Committee, a member of Environment, Judiciary, and Transportations Committee. So he's got a lot of hats he's wearing. He was elected in 2018 and re-elected this last, November into the 26th state Senate district, which includes Westport and areas down there. He is a graduate from Westport Public School, Phi Beta Kappa from Georgetown University, and has interned for the Democratic National Committee, analyzing state legislation and voting rights. He's also, when he was at Georgetown, he helped launch the Free Speech Project, dedicating to monitoring and protecting freedom of expression. In Connecticut, we know Senator Haskell for his passion for improving criminal justice system and working with Connecticut's Office of the Public Defender. And he also drew national attention to the issue of cyberbullying in Staples High School. He is, as a Senate Chairman of the Higher Education Employment Committee, Senator Haskell is a leader in policies regarding the sexual misconduct at schools, as we just heard, and is laser focused in providing businesses with 21st century workforce that's needed to thrive in Connecticut. He is really helped us in making sure that survivors have a voice at the legislature and seen as people who are, he works for us in the committee. So thank you, Senator Haskell. And then Elizabeth Conklin is, as we heard earlier, she's the inaugural Associate Vice President for Institutional Equity, Access, and Belonging, which is very clearly says what her job title is. She's in charge of all those things at Yale University. And that's a new job for her, so congratulations. We've worked with Elizabeth for a number of years, as Beth said earlier, particularly working on on the legislation that Connecticut has. We're a leader in the country on the legislation, and Elizabeth was an integral part of creating that legislation. So we're so happy that you're here with us today. She is, prior to doing this, she's also was at UConn as a Title IX coordinator, ADA coordinator and vice president for the Office of Institutional Equity. So she again is very well versed in all these issues. Elizabeth earned her law degree from the University of Oregon School of Law. She's cum laude graduate of the University of Connecticut, and where she earned her bachelor's degree with independent double major in political science and peace studies. So really very well good to work with the legislature. The other thing that Elizabeth did and was really worked, she was the chairperson of the legislature committee. So the task force, we refer to it as a task force on Title IX, but its real name is a task force to examine the impact of the proposed regulations on students and campus safety at institutions of higher education in the state. So it's quite a mouthful, and every time I have to look it up to say what it is. But that was the Higher Education's Committee way to look at what was the new regulations and how they would actually affect our Connecticut laws. So thank you all for coming here. I don't know if you have anything that you want to say before I start in on any questions, or I did want to ask Elizabeth if she could give us a little bit of background about the work on the committee, on the task force. But Senator Haskell, you have anything you want to?
Well, I'll just be very brief, and I want to say thank you to Beth for the really kind introduction, to Bridget as well, and to Lucy. It's been such a tremendous honor to work with the Alliance over the last 2 years in the legislature, and I'm so excited to have been reappointed as the chair of the Higher Education Committee so that we have an opportunity to continue working together. Of course, the Alliance knows how to move legislation through the building, but the really valuable thing, I think, in working together is that this group of people brings tremendous knowledge about working with survivors. I think the numbers, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the Alliance works with more than 8,000 survivors every year. They conduct more than 50,000 trainings. You're actually doing the work, and we can't possibly advocate for policies that are going to create a more safe and inclusive and welcoming campus environment without hearing from that critical perspective that you see every day. So I just did want to thank you and say that I am looking forward to continuing to work together and looking forward to this discussion.
Thank you. So Elizabeth, there you are.
Hi.
Hi, welcome. Good morning.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. So would you be able to give us a little bit of the background on the task force?
Sure.
Great,
Yeah.
thank you.
Let me begin by saying thank you. I'm so glad to be here. I have really appreciated the collaboration between the Alliance, formerly Contacts, which I still sometimes call you, and colleges and universities. And I think the power of collaboration has been apparent in how we've moved the state forward. And so I just want to say thank you for your ongoing commitment to working with higher education and understanding that I think we all share the same general larger picture objective of eradicating sexual violence in the state and on our campuses. And while sexual violence still occurs, of providing support and resources that are trauma-informed, that are appropriate, you have helped all of us to figure out how to do that better in higher education. Your campus advocates sit on our community resource teams through the legislation that we helped push through in 12, 14, and 16. Your advocates are supporting our students. Your policy team and leadership are constantly working with leaders, many of whom are on this phone or Zoom meeting, to figure out how to do it better. And so you have impacted the lives of numerous people. You know some of them that you work with, but even students that you never see, that you've helped us to serve better. So I just wanted to say thank you for that. And then as a general disclaimer, I was Title IX coordinator at UConn for the last nearly 10 years. I'm in the new role at Yale. I work very closely with Stephanie Spangler and Jason Kilheffer and the other Title IX folks on the campus. I no longer have direct Title IX oversight at Yale, though I'm certainly working closely with these issues. So let me speak about the task force, which was a really interesting thing. I think that we just had the task force report, thank you, Elise, sent out to all of you. This is a link to the report that I'm just going to briefly talk about. So in the 2019 session, this bill was passed. It was a pretty short section that said, if and when the proposed regulations went into effect, the Title IX regulations, this committee should be impaneled and discuss the impact of students, particularly in Connecticut. That was the substantive charge to the group, which is obviously really broad. We had a really good committee. It included some folks who are probably on this call. I know I heard Linda Blosey. I don't know if Dom or Andrea are here. Bridget also was able to provide a lot of sort of behind the scenes feedback. Thank you for watching our CTN meetings. I don't know how many viewers we had, I think a handful, but you were always one of them and provided great feedback. So we were really meeting to discuss what the impact of the regulations would be in Connecticut. And we sent out the link to our report, which I think is helpful as we talk about this. But we met on 4 occasions via Zoom. We also had some email dialogue. And we really wanted to not provide sort of a 20-page treatise that would not be helpful, but really focus in on the areas that our group of advocates, campus folks, public safety folks, and others felt was the most critical. And so I think a lot of our conversations focused on the fact that we have Connecticut state law. A lot of us call it, or still sometimes call it by the public acts like 1411, 1923, but it's in statute 10A-55. We have pretty specific state requirements that most of you are familiar with around how campuses must respond to incidents of sexual misconduct. Then we had these federal regulations. As Bridget so perfectly summarized, prior to that, under the Biden, or I say Biden administration, I guess I'm looking forward, under the Obama administration, Vice President Biden was actually a chief architect of a lot of the 8 years of regulation, and really it was not regulation, it was guidance and action around sexual violence on college campuses. I think many of you may know, but not everyone may know, that then Vice President Biden was very much the driver on a lot of that. So I think that tells us something about what's to come shortly. But we had a lot of guidance, but it didn't have the force of law. And so the Trump administration came in and said, these regulations were problematic and we need something with the force of law. So the regulations went into effect. And what we looked at as a task force was really, okay, so we have the state law, we have some corresponding law under the federal Clery Act that impacts this area, the Violence Against Women Act, and now we have these regulations. And so first we were really looking at, are there conflicts? In the 2033-page document, the federal government basically said there are no conflicts because we say there are no conflicts. Now, arguably as a legal matter, perhaps there's no direct conflict, but certainly I think it can be confusing for students and institutions to have such a maze of regulations. So we put together a chart that's in that link to sort of compare. And I think the outcome here is that the federal regulations have required virtually all institutions either to adopt separate policies for incidents falling under the regulations, which is actually a fairly narrow slice of the pie of sexual misconduct incidents that we see, which the next panel I think we'll talk about, and to retain our longstanding, much more organically developed in concert with state law policies that we had all worked really hard on for years. So you're going to see a blend of approaches across the state. I know some campuses on the call just modified and still have one policy with maybe offshoots for procedures. Others have 2 totally separate policies and procedures. But essentially, schools need to comply both with the state law requirements and the federal law requirements that don't necessarily directly conflict, but they do require schools to navigate a pretty complex series of requirements. So we looked at the distinctions and any statutory definitions, and our recommendation was that institutions make sure to be clear in their messaging to students and faculty and staff about what these different policies and procedures were. And that flowed right into the second recommendation, if you're following along, which was to do really clear and consistent messaging and training for Connecticut students. The clear message being, you don't have to become an expert in whether your issue falls under these new regulations or what that means. We are here to provide support and resources. Support and resources can be provided regardless of whether this falls under a Title IX regulation or not. schools have the ability, and I believe every Connecticut school is continuing to investigate and provide resources and support for the myriad cases that fall outside of the regulations, which is the majority of cases because the regulatory definition is so tight and very narrow, as Bridget just described. So we recommended ongoing messages by institutes of higher education to students regarding the ongoing availability of resources. And I think you'll hear in the next panel, certainly I can speak for the two institutions I've most recently been with, that more did not change than changed. And so the importance to articulate that so that folks wouldn't feel like they can't come forward. We were not going to throw away the last 10 years of hard work, and for many of you, more than 10 years of hard work, just because these regulations were in place. And I think that commitment was really strong. One of the topics that I think we're going to speak more about on this panel is ADR, the idea of alternative dispute resolution. So quickly, the prior administration, the Obama-Biden administration, had essentially said there is no place for mediation in sexual misconduct cases. It's not appropriate, don't do it, in its guidance. In the over 2,000-page text, the Trump regulations say that mediation or alternative dispute resolution may be used, not required to be used, but that it may be used, but not in cases where there's an uneven power dynamic. So don't use mediation between a faculty and the student. That would never be appropriate. But then in some circumstances, mediation or other alternative dispute resolution, restorative justice principles might be appropriate. This is a really substantive area for more dialogue. I think that this is really considered a cutting edge issue that many schools have been looking into, not only for sexual misconduct and intimate partner violence and stalking, but also for other forms of problematic behaviors on campus. And so the question is, does sexual misconduct and other related matters have a place in a restorative justice or mediation framework? And that's a really active dialogue that I think we'll get into. What we were saying was that we should be looking at best practices at that, and that we need to really consider statewide, what are the best practices there? And that places to do that include this very group, as well as the Connecticut Title IX Coordinator Coalition. Fourth, we talked about anonymous reports and complaints and participation in the Title IX process. So under both state law and the federal regulations, an individual may submit an anonymous complaint. And so we wanted to underscore that can still happen, but also that given the very strict evidentiary requirements of matters falling under the Title IX regulations, schools do need to make clear that they may be limited in their ability to act in an investigative fashion if a complaint came in anonymously falling under the Title IX regulations. Does not mean a school cannot do anything, but a school may be limited in going through a full investigation process without an active complainant. Again, doesn't mean other measures can't be taken, but we thought schools should be clear about that. And then we had a lot of discussion, as we have for years, but I think particularly the nation is really in a moment that is quite powerful of talking about what is the impact of the regulations on students from traditionally marginalized or oppressed communities. We know that students who identify as LGBTQ and from racial and ethnic backgrounds, BIPOC students, are at greater risk and may also face extreme barriers to reporting, certainly to law enforcement, but also to schools. So our thought there as a committee was, we need to be very mindful at this time that any perceptions of detrimental impacts that the regulations may have on the ability for a complainant, a survivor, to come forward may be much greater for students falling into those categories. So our thought there and our guidance there was that schools should be mindful of that reality. Those were the major places we focused. If you haven't seen the report before, hopefully the link is helpful. I'll stop there to allow for more dialogue.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thanks for all your work on that. And I will say that the definitions comparison chart is really quite helpful, because for me, figuring out what the federal Title IX, but then you have Clery, and then you have our state laws in it, and then our state criminal laws as well. Really, it helps with that. So thank you. So I suggest everyone take a look at it if you're interested in that. But also the report is very succinct and adds some great ideas. And I think the biggest thing is really getting the word out of what's really happening here. And so I think we can all work on that together as well. Do either of you, and Will or Bridget, do you have anything that you want to add to that, or we can get into some questions? But
I did just want to echo what you said, Lucy. Everybody should take a look at this report, and I want to thank Ms. Conklin and the entire team. While everybody else in the world, I think, was focused on politics, they were zeroing in on the important details of public policy. I think I received this report in my inbox the morning after Election Day, which was pretty striking and exciting. That I was just so grateful for the work that they've done. You know, I also just want to reiterate exactly what Ms. Conklin said. This report I view as a call for Connecticut to continue the wonderful work that was done. By the way, long before I got to the legislature, people like Senator May Flexer, Representative Greg Haddad spearheaded so much of the work in the previous sessions, and they deserve a world of credit for having done that. But I joined the panel today primarily to say that in the face of these changing rules, Connecticut should certainly not back down. We now have an administration where hopefully we can work collaboratively as opposed to being the first line of defense against what President Trump and Secretary DeVos were doing. I hope that we're going to be able to build upon progress with the Biden team. And obviously, these rules were set forth through a formal regulatory process. It's not going to be overnight that they can be undone. I'm sure Ms. Conklin probably knows way more about that process than I do, but I do know that there's guidance that can be issued, there's acts of Congress that ought to be considered, and hopefully a reform that can be a reform process through the formal rulemaking system that can be started as soon as we have a President Biden after Inauguration Day. So looking forward to digging into the details, and also happy to discuss, we've referenced a few times the Campus Climate Bill, the Every Voices Act. That's something that I think is going to be really critical in the upcoming session. It's a top priority for me, and I know many committee members. By the way, on both sides of the aisle, something that's so interesting and I find inspiring about this issue is it really actually does bring us together at a time when partisan divisions seem so steep. By the way, we saw even Jerry Falwell, the conservative president of Liberty University, submit comments against President Trump and Betsy DeVos's proposed regulations. I think that we all, whether it's survivors, policymakers, or institutions, recognize that there are just an abundance of problems that stem from statutory definitions conflicting. Obviously, during the rulemaking process, we heard from institutions about just how problematic it is when there's a difference between preponderance of evidence and clear and convincing evidence. Someone's knocking at my door, so I better deal with that, but I'll be right back.
Okay, thanks. Okay. It's always when you're on Zoom, right? You get a phone call or somebody comes to your door. So I guess some of the questions we had thought about, and I guess one of the ones that I was thinking about is that we know, Connecticut's, our laws are on sexual misconduct on campus are considered some of the best in the nation because of the work that everyone did. I was not part of the Alliance, so I can't take any credit for it, but I certainly like riding on the coattails of them. And so thank you, Elizabeth. And again, to Greg Haddad, Representative Haddad and Senator Flexer, because they really did a yeoman's work on that. So given, I was glad to hear you said that there's more of not changing than changing. So I think that maybe that answers my question, is that there are things that we need to do. But one thing that I'm really interested in is affirmative consent, because we were the first state to recognize affirmative consent. And many states followed us in terms of, where both parties have to agree verbally that they're okay with the sexual conduct. So is there anything in the current regulations that would affect the affirmative consent standard?
Yeah, so it's interesting. The regulations, part of the confusion is the way they point to federal definitions, which are outlined in the chart. But the regulations actually took pains. It's in Section 106.30 for those of you who just happen to be flipping through the 2,000-page document. But the federal government actually specifically declined to adopt a particular definition of consent. and said that schools could continue to use whatever definition of consent they wanted to. I think this was a huge part of the dialogue and concern from higher ed, and one of the big comments higher ed was making. But they said that you must define consent and you must apply that definition consistently. But they specifically wrote in their commentary that the definition of consent is best a matter best left to the discretion of colleges and universities, many of whom are under state law requirements to apply particular definitions of consent for purposes of sexual misconduct policies. This was a change from the proposed regulations, and I think that was done in particular so that they could say there are no actual conflicts with state law in these regs. That was important to them. And if you think about sort of the viewpoint of the current administration, somewhat heavy on the concept of state rights in some of these areas. So we really are completely leaning on the state law definition of consent, which is, for those of you who still have that attachment up, it's there, it's in 10A-55. It's somewhat late in the PDF, but it's on page 24 of that PDF that we sent out in the chat. But in Connecticut, affirmative consent means an active, clear, and voluntary agreement by a person to engage in sexual activity with another person. And so those can be words, those can be actions. You're all pretty familiar with that. And what I really think that we appreciated on the higher ed side with respect to the way the state law developed there is that we were given room to each college and university make its own affirmative consent definition. Because in 2016, when affirmative consent was passed as law, every institution in the state of Connecticut already was using affirmative consent. And we already had definitions on our campuses that we used for that. So I think some of us tweaked them to ensure consistency with state law, but it was a very rich discussion with Senator Flexer and Representative Haddad about giving us a little bit of room to apply definitions that our students, in some cases, I know that was true at Yale and UConn, students had a lot of input into crafting those definitions over the past years. And so I think that's a good example in Connecticut of legislation that was passed to ensure that stays that way, but also deference given to the students and schools that had come to these places. So you'll see slight variations in the affirmative consent definitions across the Connecticut institutions. Yale's wording is a little different than UConn's wording, for example, but they all comply with that general 10A-55 requirement.
Well, it sort of makes sense that there would be some, given the different types of schools that we have and their populations, that there'd be some variance as long as there's I guess, a floor and a consistent definition. Thank you. Well,
Well, I just wanted to add, unless Bridget was going to jump in, I wanted to say that one major takeaway in reading the report is just how much information campuses are going to have to distribute to students. This stuff doesn't come naturally as you're trying to get a college education and enjoy your 2 or 4 year experience on campus. Not everyone's going to be, steeped in the intricate details of Title IX proceedings, but unfortunately, I think that the new federal regulations do place a little bit more of an onus on students to understand their regulations, and going along with that, on campuses and administrators to really create clear and concise guidelines. For example, I was frustrated and saddened that I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe in that 2,000-page guidance, it specifies that Title IX coordinators are really the only folks who can begin formal investigative procedures, whereas other authority figures like RAs, for example, can't begin those procedures. As a student, that would be confusing. I know I sought a position on the higher education committee when I got to the legislature because I was recently on a college campus myself. I know who my RA was. I know where they lived. I had their cell phone number. I did not know who the Title IX coordinator was or where I could find him or her. So we're asking a little bit more of college students, I think, under these guidelines, and it's going to be on all of us to make sure that it's clear and comprehensible, the new systems that will be in place. And in some cases, the dual systems, right? I mean, certainly students should and can go to their RAs, but it will be, correct me if I'm wrong, Ms. Conklin, but I think it will be a different proceeding that is put into place, as opposed to if you go to a Title IX coordinator.
Yeah, I think the regs were really confusing about the role of the Title IX coordinator, and I really appreciate you bringing it up because throughout the regs, it's contemplated that the Title IX coordinator will do all sorts of things, provide support, initiate complaints, buried deep in the preamble. I believe it's around page 1245, but don't quote me because some of this has gone away from my brain over the last 2 months, and I don't have that binder in front of me. I have my shortcut binder in front of me, but the buried was the idea that these duties could be delegated to a whole host of folks on campus. And so one of the practices some of our campuses across the state used was to put an MOU into effect about when the regs say Title IX coordinator must, there's actually room that other folks can do this. With respect to your comment in particular, I agree that a read of the regs is confusing there. I think the way that it breaks down is that the Title IX coordinator is empowered to file a complaint on behalf of a non-participating complainant if the Title IX coordinator believes there to be the need for that process. But the reality is, if the matter falls under the regulations and the complainant's not participating, you're not going to be able to get very far because no statements of the complainant can be used if they're not willing to subject themselves to cross-examination. So I think that's the tie that binds. And I think that's one of the biggest problems with the regs, particularly in cases involving employees, where an institution under Title VII must act. And this is just my perspective as me, I'm not speaking for any institution, but in my perspective, actually the most problematic part of the entire regs is the conflict between Title IX and Title VII. And it is another place where in the preamble, in the sort of high 80s, 90s pages, the government just asserts there's no conflict between your Title VII, which is your employment discrimination obligations, and your Title IX obligations. And I think there's an enormous problem in cases involving faculty or staff members that fall under the regs. If you have a student who doesn't want to participate in a process, but you also have a Title VII obligation to ensure a non-discriminatory workplace. And I think that's actually some of the real actual conflict. Our task force report didn't get into that because our charge was to focus on the impact on students. We didn't go super deep there, and it's quite the rabbit hole, but I think that's a real issue as a practical matter if you have an employment case that fits within the regs. I will say, certainly I would hope, I can't speak for all institutions, but that processes like having RAs continue to be responsible employees or folks who would report into the Title IX coordinator would cause a report to an RA to be handled just as it was pre-reg, report provided to T9, team, support offered, and process offered to the student. So, I think particularly under the Clery Act, which causes RAs to have to report crimes to the police under the Clery Act. I think that linkage with RAs would still be in place functionally on campus, but completely understand, Senator Haskell, where a plain reading of the regs would cause you to say, wait a second, like do all these people no longer have to do anything? This is another area where the regs were permissive rather than requiring. So they said, you don't have to make all these people responsible employees anymore. They don't have to tell the Title IX coordinator, but you may. And I'm not aware of any institution in Connecticut that scaled back responsible employee reporting obligations for RAs or others.
That's really reassuring to hear. That's wonderful. I was struck to your point about the complexity of the Title IX coordinator role under these regs. I was struck by a comment in the Times where it was not in Connecticut, but a Title IX coordinator elsewhere said, I signed up to protect civil rights and education, and now I feel like I'm tasked with running a courtroom. So to your point, these regs are so complex, and I'm sure we will all, including myself, work to continue to understand them and figure out how we can protect students and survivors and here in Connecticut.
Yeah, and again, I think this is one of those spaces where that messaging is so critical. When Elizabeth mentioned that in the report, I think there are so many folks that may have, read certain articles, had a certain understanding, and don't necessarily know that we have these practices in the state of Connecticut. So students that may even be active in this work on their campuses may not understand the complexities of the final Title IX rule. As we're all professionals here, and still working through this document. So I think it's going to be really critical that within that messaging, students will have, the understanding as to who is a responsible employee on their campus and what that means, especially because there may be some differences from campus to campus because of the discretion that the rules provide campuses. And I think additionally, going back to affirmative consent, under our state law, institutions need to utilize that definition, in their program. That definition of the investigation, and through that investigation. So I think that what's good about our state laws that does actually coincide well with the consistency that the federal government is requiring for the definitions of consent to be utilized through a case and on a campus.
Yeah, I think it's also important that when we are talking about cases of sexual violence, right, that people have that they want to speak to, and they may not want to talk to somebody that they don't know, no matter how well trained and prepared they are for those conversations. And so it's really great to hear that, and that Connecticut is, that we are all pretty much on the same page of making sure that that we can use RAs and coaches and others that people may disclose to. So we only have a few minutes, but I did want to touch on one of the things that, and Elizabeth touched on it as well earlier when she was talking about the report. But one of the recommendations in the final rules was regarding dispute resolution of sexual misconduct cases using mediation, excuse me. Since sexual violence is more about power than sex, and stems from a perpetrator's need to dominate and for control, there's a question about when we use mediation, you may have a power dynamic that isn't really in balance. And so I guess I wanted to ask about in one case, sexual harassment cases, they use mediation, but how do we ensure that a respondent is protected, not being forced into using mediation or a restorative justice plan that might be better for the school, but not necessarily better for the student? And do you have any suggestions of what would be sort of appropriate next steps to look at that?
Sure, I'm happy to start on this, but welcome Senator Haskell's thoughts as well. So the question of how best to use alternative dispute resolution, which I think includes a real menu of options, is something that campuses are grappling with in a good way, really thinking about where is alternative dispute resolution more appropriate. As the tenor of discourse in our nation has gotten so polarized and dividing, so too has it become on our campuses. And, I think I've been in higher ed now for only 10 years. There are certainly folks on this call who've been around longer than me. But even in that time frame, I have seen a change in the willingness of students and also employees to sort of work things out. So there are certainly scenarios. Let's talk about a roommate dispute where alternative dispute resolution makes sense. Somebody's staying up too late and being loud or being messy. I don't think sexual misconduct is the place to begin using alternative dispute resolution on campus. I think you start smaller. I think you start with empowering students and ideally employees with the skills to resolve conflict on all of the day-to-day conflicts that all of us find ourselves in all the time. I think we need to be really careful and thoughtful about how ADR would be used in the sexual misconduct setting. I think there's a really different range of cases, and without spelling it out, there are cases that are very severe, and there are cases that may be a one-time comment involving no touching. So in a one-time comment scenario, you may imagine a conversation that could be educational and resolve the issue. But in a matter involving, serious sexual misconduct, any sexual misconduct is serious, but in terms of the range of the types of cases, or in a matter involving intimate partner violence, we need to be really thoughtful about how that's happening. I can speak to my experience at Yale with restorative justice, which is that there's a really active restorative justice working group with dozens of professionals engaged in a lot of education of ourselves right now to begin. There are some universities that really specialize in ADR, learning about what does it look like to use it, including in the sexual misconduct space. But I would say across the academy and at the institutions I've been at, that's very much a learning for administrators phase. And any movement to implement restorative justice or ADR generally is a multi-year effort. And then to move into using it for these very serious matters would be later down the road. So, you know, the last thing I'd say is that in my work and learning, there certainly are survivors who have indicated that that was the right path for them. For anybody who's not seen it, I really recommend the documentary, A Better Man, which is really fascinating look at, they allowed it to be filmed, a restorative justice process that was used between two people, one of whom had been a victim of a survivor of intimate partner violence. And I watched this a month ago and it really blew my mind about what are the options here. It also caused me to say, I think we're years away from being ready in higher education to use these types of processes. They take deep expertise. So that's a long-winded way of saying, I think there are matters where it could be totally appropriate, but if you're using it, we need to be sure that there's appropriate training and understanding. And the foundational bedrock principle of mediation in particular is that it is voluntary. So it must be voluntary and parties must be able to rescind participation. That is just foundational in the field of mediation. So those are my thoughts. I'm sorry if they're a little scattered. I think there's promise here. And I think that we hear that the criminal and campus processes can feel unsatisfying. So I think that there is promise, but I think it must be done really carefully.
Well, it's hard to build on that, I think, exceptional and thorough answer. I would just say that a huge concern during the rulemaking process and something that caught so many headlines was the pushback on the notion that survivors of sexual assault and misconduct may be cross-examined in hearings. And the answer to that concern can't possibly to create more interpersonal, rather to force upon survivors more interpersonal interactions with the person who perpetrated that violence. I really like the idea of restorative justice in a whole bunch of other areas. Lucy mentioned earlier that I serve on the Judiciary Committee, and survivors of all sorts of other crimes, gun violence, theft, have actually signaled a willingness to engage with those who perpetrated that crime. And I think it's a really exciting area of study and conversation. But the key question as we approach restorative justice techniques in the world of sexual misconduct is, do survivors actually want this? And I think that's exactly what Ms. Conklin said, providing an opportunity for them to opt out and for this never to be forced upon any situation is really fundamental as we continue the conversation.
Yeah, thank you very much for both of you for that response, because it is something that the Alliance has been grappling with as well, just as the conversation becomes more prevalent around the different alternatives. And so we are glad that we would, love to walk hand in hand with you all on this too, and trying to figure it out, because cases of sexual assault are very different than some other cases and what's left behind. So I think we're a couple minutes after. I don't know if we have any questions. I know we had a little bit of a time, we had a break that people can take or not, I guess, since your videos are probably off. But I did want to say that I actually wanted to add too about the campus climate bill, that one piece of it too that's very important, I think, and would help with our state laws, is the amnesty provision, which would allow people to report cases of sexual misconduct if they were at a party or something where they are breaking the school rules, that they would get amnesty for reporting that and not get in trouble for breaking the other rules, which I think is critically important, and is one of the things that Bridget has told me is really something that stops people from reporting. And the other piece, just quickly, is that with a survey, one of the things that we were able to pass in the other legislation where colleges write a report, which you can find on the committee page on the Higher Education and Employment Committee page, reports from all the colleges of what they're doing to prevent sexual misconduct on campuses. But this would require the colleges to do surveys of students, many colleges which were already starting to do this, but to do surveys of students to see if those plans are really working, how they perceive them. So it's a natural next step to what we've already done. So I just wanted to give it a little bit of a boost here, and because glad to hear that. And I'm not surprised that Senator Haskell's going forward with that.
Yeah, Lucy, I'm so glad you bring it up. And given the fact that there are so many advocates and activists on the call today, I did just want to ask for help in the months ahead. Obviously, the legislature is inheriting, when we return in January, a public health crisis that has compounded the greatest recession since the Great Depression. There's going to be a lot on the agenda related to COVID-19, but it's important that we take up the important legislative business that was interrupted by this pandemic. I really believe that the Every Voices bill would have become law in Connecticut if the legislature hadn't so abruptly adjourned in March. So we're going to need everybody at the table once again testifying in support. As soon as there's a bill number, I'm sure that we'll all spread the word so that everyone can feel they have a seat at the table. But both provisions, the amnesty provision and the campus climate survey, are so important. And to your point, many institutions around Connecticut are already doing these things, just as many institutions in Connecticut already had the affirmative consent standard in place. But making sure that that's a matter of state statute and standardizing those protections across the state of Connecticut is so crucial. Yes, we're facing a pandemic, but we also know that 12% of students on a college campus experience sexual misconduct, and that's only the ones who report it. So opening up opportunities for more students to share their perspectives and their experiences in an anonymous fashion will help us deal with this other epidemic on campus.
Yeah, that was great. So thank you very much for continuing to work on that. We'll be behind you. And I agree, it was the only bill that we were working on that actually made it out of committee.
Yeah, and I would just say, I think the amnesty provision makes all the sense in the world. And it reminds me of affirmative consent in that I think most schools are doing it, but having it as we did affirmative consent will ensure that protection. And climate surveys are I think they're both the best practice because the difference between reported cases and what's reported in a climate survey is eye-opening. And it can also tell administrators what's working well and what's not. My plug from the higher ed side would be continuing the conversations. We had excellent conversations during the winter and spring before the shutdown, just as we have in all the prior legislation, allowing campuses to make these work in a way that works on their campuses. I know Yale is very engaged in the AAU climate survey. UConn is looking into using that as well. And I think for many, it's considered the gold standard survey. It's administered every 4 years. And it allows not only institutional comparison year on year, but also comparison across the field. And there's a lot of power in that. So not all campuses can afford participation there. And I think we need to be mindful of that reality. But I think on both amnesty and the campus climate survey, allowing campuses some room to navigate within any new laws added to the existing laws is really critical. That's been our history in the state. So I would encourage that we make sure that, particularly with the climate survey piece, folks who are weighing in there are really survey experts. I don't consider myself one. I consider institutional research folks to be experts in survey design, and that is who designed the various instruments that most of our campuses are using. So that would be my plug on that bill. But I think both amnesty and climate surveys are critical to campuses' response, as well as gauging what more they can do. So I think we're all generally on the same page. There may be more details to discuss as the bill winds its way through, just as we did last year. And I would welcome those conversations, as I know my colleagues who are more directly in Title IX across the state would as well.
Well, we will be hearing in the next panel from our Title IX coordinators, so maybe there'll be a spot for that. And I do want to say too that the Connecticut Consortium to End Sexual Violence, which is a consortium of higher education institutions, Bridget is going to be talking about this later about sort of revamping it, but that, one of the things we'll be able to do is talk about legislation and policy in that group and make sure that everybody is connected in that. So I think so we can get something just like these other laws that were readily accepted by all people. So we do have 5 minutes till our next panel. We can take a break for 5 minutes. I don't know if there are any questions. If anyone has any questions, no questions, I just see. I want to thank you very much for coming. This was great. This was really very helpful and sort of helped me get excited about the session, which frankly, I wasn't feeling so excited about. And who knows how it's going to go either. It may just be like this, I'm thinking, right? It's going to be probably Zoom, a Zoom type of session. But
Can I jump really quick? There is one question
yes.
that was sent, unfortunately, just to me. So I want to make sure that it's posed to the panelists before we sign off. That question is, how do you manage the presence of accused and accuser on campus while resources are being put in place to investigate and support?
Yeah, and I think our next panel of Title IX coordinators can really speak to this, but I'll just say briefly, it's a challenge, and I think schools are always considering the best ways to do that. I saw Jen Longa on this call. She's UConn's Assistant Dean for Victim Support Services. So on that campus, on my current campus, there's a center called SHARE that helps to organize accommodations for any parties involved, even witnesses, to ensure that somebody's not necessarily having to be in situations where they're confronted with seeing the person that they're in this process with. Those can get tricky, but we have a long history of doing things like changing classrooms and resident hall locations, dining locations, things like that, to make things as, it's comfortable is too strong a word because it's not comfortable, but to make things as livable as possible with the students surrounded by support, while ensuring a fair process that ideally, I think part of a fair process on campus is the one that moves along. Not so fast that it's not complete, because I've seen that happen and that's a problem, but that is measured ideally in weeks, not months. That requires significant staffing and resources from administration, upper administration. But I think you're looking at a fair and relatively speedy investigation and a lot of support and resources being wrapped around the student through trained resources.
Great. Thank you. And we probably will hear more, as you said, come in and talk about this in the next panel. But I really I want to thank you all for joining us today. This has been really just great, helpful. And so it's nice to be engaged in this. And again, thank you, Elizabeth, for your work you've done on in the past, but also on taking on this task force and having a very short time frame to come up with a final report. And so that was great.
Yeah,
and Senator Haskell, thank you. Yeah.
Senator Haskell, you got the report the day after Election Day. It was due 2 days later. We purposely waited because if there was a clear presidential outcome, we planned to have a sentence. If Biden was not, we didn't know what was happening then. As you know, the couple days after were really intense. So we had planned to write a sentence in the report. Given the result of the election, the regulations will likely be overturned at some point during a Biden administration or stay in force. We couldn't write that sentence. So we had this placeholder. So that's why you got it the morning after, because it was clear to all of us it would take a while. So that's just a little fun behind the scenes for everyone.
That is awesome. That's really interesting to know. It was a chaotic few days, that's for sure.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I really
thank you,
appreciate
Lucy
it.
and Bridget and everybody. Always great to be with you, Elizabeth, as well, and looking forward to working with you in the months ahead.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much.
Okay, so I guess next, Bridget, we're going to head into the Title IX. So I'm going to say goodbye and pass it over to you. Thank you so much, Bridget, for this.
Of course, thank you. I think in the interest of time, we'll just move forward with our programming. But if anybody needs to step off to take a break at any point, of course, that's entirely understood. Thank you again, Senator Haskell and Elizabeth Conklin, for sharing your time and expertise with us today, and Lucy for leading us in such an interesting discussion. So I'm excited to have a discussion this morning about best practices in sexual violence response from the perspectives of leaders working in Title IX offices statewide. We'll be reviewing what trends have looked like regarding Title IX cases, what's being done to ensure survivors have access to equitable services in these spaces. So I'd like to start, of course, by giving our panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves. If you have any questions you'd like to ask these panelists, once again, please feel free to put your questions in the chat. And we will have time for an audience Q&A at the conclusion here. My colleagues are monitoring the chat to ensure that your questions are addressed. So could each of you just please share your name, title, and a brief overview of the work that you've done in the anti-sexual violence movement and Title IX work?
I guess I could start. Hi, I'm Jessica Waterhouse. I am a program coordinator in criminal justice at Tungus Community College, and I was the Title IX coordinator there for several years. And now I've been moved over to doing the investigations. There's been lots of changes in the criminal and the community college system. So I'd be happy to help try to figure all that out, because some of the things that are happening are not, I think, best practices, but we do have a good, solid team at Tungus.
Thank you so much for being here today. I'll go based on who I see on screen. Ebony, would you like to introduce yourself?
Good morning. I am Ebony Manning. I am the Associate Dean for Equity and Compliance Programs and the Title IX Coordinator at Connecticut College, which is also my alma mater. I have been here for, I think I'm starting my third year, or I'm into my third year, which it seems longer. And I oversee all of Title IX for the campus, and I also oversee the Office of Sexual Violence Prevention and Advocacy on campus.
Great, thank you so much for being here. And then Sarah?
Good morning. Thanks for having me. So I'm Sarah Chipman. I'm with the University of Connecticut. I'm currently the Interim Associate Vice President, Title IX Coordinator and ADA Coordinator for UConn's Office of Institutional Equity, filling Elizabeth Conklin's shoes after her departure for Yale. I've been at OIE since 2014, focusing on investigations of discrimination, harassment, and sexual harassment by employees primarily. But I also have experience investigating allegations of sexual assault, stalking, and intimate partner violence by students. My role also includes training both students and employees on these topics and related university policies. Like I said, I've been in this current position since August, overseeing OIE, which is responsible for administering the university's non-discrimination policies, ensuring compliance with state and federal EEO and non-discrimination law and regulations, including but not limited to Title IX. And I'm happy to be here today.
Thank you so much for joining us. We do have one other panelist lined up, Raina Dighton-White from the University of St. Joseph. I just get a message from her saying she's having trouble getting in. So we're having somebody work on that on the technical end, but I'll be glad to welcome her once she is in here as well. So thank you all again for taking the time to introduce yourselves and for joining us here today. Based on your experiences with Title IX at your institutions, what have been some trends that you may have noticed in the last couple of years since the proposed rules were released, as well as in the last few months since those final rules were published by the department?
Okay, well, it's been very difficult for a community college. We've always been a commuter college, and we just had a big change in who is the Title IX coordinator. And so we're in the middle of a transition for Title IX coordinators, but we do not see the same type of cases that you would see on a residential college. So some of the guidelines that affect Title IX are a little bit different in how they haven't affected the change as much because we don't have many occurrences on our campuses. We get a lot of disclosures of things that happened, whether it happened recently or in the past. So in the community colleges, there's a huge focus on support. And I know that's very different from a residential.
Over the years, we've seen, so before I became the Title IX coordinator at Con, we didn't have one. Well, we had one, but it was the Dean of Institutional Equity and Inclusion, and he was trying his best to just wear all the hats, and it wasn't working. So when I came on, there was a period of, can we trust this person? Can we trust the system? We haven't had someone for so long. And then after a while with promoting and me putting myself out there and letting everyone know I am the Title IX coordinator, here's my office, this is what I do, we started to see an uptick in reporting, which we found was a kind of like a testament to the trust that students were starting to gain for our system. And so last year, I think we had like the most reporting in the last like 4 years or so. But we are starting to see a lot of anonymous reporting and where students who just want me to know what's going on, but they don't want to go through the process. And so we're trying to figure out like, how do we get them to the point where they want to go through the process? Like what kind of outreach can we do? But we also have seen a lot of students utilize our confidential advocates. So our Office of Sexual Violence Prevention and Advocacy, our lead victim advocate is the director of that office. And we had 3 additional, one since left. So we have 2 additional confidential advocates. And they've been really busy. We've put a system in place where students can just click on a link and plop themselves on one of the advocates' calendar and make their own appointment and give them agency of when they want to talk. And then the advocates talk to them about, well, do you want to go to Title IX? I can go over there with you. And they explain. So they're well versed in what Title IX is and how it works. So they can explain to the students about Title IX and the process, and then they can bring them over to me. So since the new regs, and I should say since COVID, right? Because I think that has a lot to do with how our students are reporting or what's going on with our students. We had one this year. And I am sort of, someone asked me, like, do you think it's the Title IX regulations or you think it's COVID? And I think it's a combination of both, right? Students trying to figure out, well, what is this new process? And do I really want to go through a hearing? Or does this actually fit under Title IX? And then the idea of, we don't have as many students on our campus as we did prior to 2020. A lot of students are remote, have chose to take classes virtually. So we have a smaller number on campus. And then the ones that are on campus are very isolated. They're in their rooms. We're telling them they can't talk or be with anyone. So we haven't seen many cases this year. And I want to see if that change in 2021. But, and then the case that we did have, it was kind of a straightforward case. That didn't go through the whole hearing process and things like that. So it's interesting. I'm looking to see if we're going to get more people reporting or if it's going to be anonymous. We've gotten a couple of anonymous cases that we're trying to figure out how do we get people to feel more comfortable with reporting and not using our anonymous reporting system. Like, we want to hear what's going on, but we also want to help. But I'm hopeful because they are reaching out to our confidential advocates.
Yeah, I'll jump in for UConn as well. So as far as trends over the last few years, our numbers and types of reports have been fairly consistent over the last few years. All of this is documented in our state legislative report, which is on our Title IX website. And we do have reports going back to 2014, if anyone wants to dig through those to take a look at the data there. I will say, as Ebony mentioned, COVID's definitely had an impact on what we're seeing come into our office. Since April, reports have been down a bit for us, largely, I would assume, due to shifts in how people are interacting, presence on campus, and those type of factors. So I think we're on track to have lower than normal overall reports this year. But it is kind of early to identify, what the trends are going to be, how cases are handled, how people are reacting to the new regulations, and how that impacts the way that they move through the process at UConn.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that the community college, the one downside is that we don't have anybody that has confidentiality. So we really rely on our community partners to be able to come to campus to speak with our students. And that's why we have such close ties with our domestic violence and our sexual assault community partners, because they're the ones that have the confidentiality. And so in this COVID life, we just don't have the students, so we're not utilizing that, but we have set that up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know further in our presentation, we'll have a couple of our campus advocates on just to speak about their role as confidential sources and how their confidentiality can be helpful for students who are disclosing in order to kind of seek out their options and have that space. So thank you so much to all of you for sharing that information and a little bit about what's going on in your individual spaces. And I agree as well, it's difficult with COVID as well on the table to navigate these conversations and what trends are looking like or what they will look like, given the challenges that students have as well to reporting in that space or changes that we're seeing to sexual violence at this time. So secondly, we know that as a result of the new Title IX regulations, many institutions have newly introduced or revised former policies in order to continue to give students and staff opportunities to seek supportive measures or move forward with a case that would now fall outside of Title IX. For example, off-campus incidents that do not fall under the campus's substantial control. So could you tell us a little bit about more of what these policies look like at your own institutions?
Well, since we're a commuter campus, I get probably 99% of the cases that come across, they were all off campus. And I think what is very important for us to train the faculty and staff to identify and we have a disclosure form, and to get that to me or the new Title IX coordinator to make sure the supports are out there. And I found that to be very successful, is that when I was Title IX and I'm a faculty member, more faculty members would just drop by my office and they said, "Oh, should this be a case?" And I said, "Yes." And I was able to get the services. Now that it's moved to the Dean of Students, I have huge conflicts with the Dean of Students being the Title IX coordinator, but that is something that our system office came down with, that all Deans of Students in the community colleges are going to be the Title IX coordinators. And I think that it's just not a good fit, because Dean of Students also does the conduct issues. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to make sure that you're not just putting another task on the full-timers.
Sure.
We implemented interim policy and we called it that, and we let our campus know that this is a living document, and we're going to continue to work on it with hopes that we get a new administration, which we are getting a new administration. So we said this is interim. We're going to put this in place. But a lot of things, as Elizabeth mentioned, kept the same. So we kept our responsible employees. We did add officials with authorities, but our House Fellows and our RAs are still responsible employees. We didn't want to shift too much for our students. We're a small campus, and our students, we worked so hard to get our students, to gain our students' trust. And so we didn't want to to change too many things. But there were things that we had to change, right? There were things that we had to add, like the hearing. And so I'm doing a lot of communication with our students. A lot of emails went out, and there's a lot of training happening. But as far as off campus, that was one of the things that our students, I think our campus was very concerned about. Like, so are we not going to do anything if it happens off campus? And what we said was, yes, we are. If it's two of our students and it happens off campus, our thought process is that will come on campus, and so we can't ignore it, right? If the effects of whatever happened off campus will happen on campus, and so we decided that we will still have jurisdiction over our two students if something happened off campus. And I've been warned that that may open us up to some sort of all sorts of legal issues, but it's like, these are our students. And we know that students are not going to, or going to shy away from contacting the police. They want the campus to handle it. They want them to do something. And so we've decided that, yes, if it's two of our students, we will still go through the process if they want to go through the process. If it's a student and one of our students and someone else, we offer our students supportive measures. We've always done that. And so we said, that's not going to change. We're still going to help you and support you through this with confidential advocates, counseling services, off-campus supports, and do what we can to help you through as much as possible the process. So some things have changed, but a lot of things we pretty much said, listen, we're going to keep our values the same, and that is about a community of care. And so we're going to support our students, we're going to support our staff the best way we can through this process, knowing that, yes, we're going to have to figure out how to handle it under the new regs, but we're also going to support our students and our staff through the process. We're not going to leave them out there.
Yeah, I would echo that at UConn as well. We've really wanted to maintain our policies and procedures intact as much as possible. So we've added and adopted where needed in order to comply with the new regulations. But particularly things like supportive measures and awareness and prevention programming, that's remained the same all along. As far as policies, where we've made updates is in our policy against discrimination, harassment, and related interpersonal violence. We have added a definition of Title IX sexual harassment that mirrors the language in the new regulations. So we've created that as an addition to the policy. And we've retained all of the other types of prohibited conduct under the policy. So non-Title IX sexual harassment is still in the policy. Still prohibited conduct, everything that was there before as far as provisions and protections, that's remained unchanged in the policy. Where we did also do an update in the policy is in our provisions concerning employee reporting responsibilities. And I know Ebony mentioned this as well, that we didn't really want to walk that back and change what, the work that we've done to train people on how to report and where to seek assistance. But what we've added to our policy is a new category of exempt employees, folks who are exempt from those reporting obligations in certain circumstances. So under this provision, employees in our cultural centers and as well as the Ombuds office can receive disclosures of sexual assault, stalking, and intimate partner violence, and provide support and assistance to those individuals who are disclosing without triggering an obligation to report those disclosures to OIE. But there are limited exceptions for imminent harm or matters involving minors. Those staff members are trained on how to provide assistance to the individuals making disclosures and how to channel them to the resources for reporting investigations if they do want to pursue those avenues. So they are getting all of that information in these disclosures and in these conversations with these exempt employees. Apart from that, the policy is largely unchanged, like I mentioned. Procedures for both student respondent and employee respondent matters have incorporated all of the procedural requirements under the regulations, but we have retained the original procedures for any non-Title IX matters. So I think, I know Elizabeth mentioned in the last panel that we foresee a fairly limited number of cases proceeding under that Title IX sexual harassment decision definition, because the scope of that definition is so limited. So we do want to still maintain the process for all of the other cases that fall outside of those that definition, but may fall under other provisions of our policies. So the procedures still exist, but we do have the Title IX procedures for those cases where we need to use those. And then apart from the changes to policy and procedures, supportive measures are the same, resources are the same. And we've also continued to message to our community about what has changed as well as what has not changed. Because I think that's really important for people to understand that, you know, they can still access supportive measures and resources, and all of that's going to be available regardless of the changes in the regulations.
Absolutely.
I think, I'm sorry, I think the messaging is the most important, right? Is talking to your campus and saying, I understand that we have these new regs, but we're still going to handle cases. And I think students I've talked with students and they're getting hung up on, so this isn't Title IX, this is going to be dismissed under Title IX and nothing's going to happen. And I'm like, it may be dismissed under Title IX and that's just the formality, but I'm going to open it up under another, section. It's going under our other misconduct policy. And we can still do an investigation. And so it's just explaining to them like, yeah, okay, so this doesn't fit under the narrow like sexual harassment, but it fits under here. And we're going to follow along this process. And it's explaining, making sure that message is out there, because I think they hear also that's a mandatory dismissal. And they're like, also, we're not going to, I don't want to report because it's not Title IX. It's like, okay, let me decide whether or not that falls under Title IX. And if it does not, here is what we can do. And when I send out letters saying, okay, so this doesn't fall under Title IX, but it falls under this, and this is what the process is, and I explain fully what that process is, it makes them feel better. Like, okay, the school is going to look into it. So it's all about the messaging, letting them know, like, yes, Title IX is a little narrower, but we still have other options to look at this case and to investigate. And there's a process. And so you're not, no, we're not going to dismiss it completely. And we grapple with that, using that language, dismissed under Title IX. It's like, oh, that feels so final. But then we explained, I do my best in the letters in talking to the students and saying, listen, yes, this doesn't fall under Title IX, but it does fall under this. And this is what we're going to do. So that helps.
Absolutely. I think, as you said, that messaging is so critical. And I'd like to thank each of you for, the work that you've done on those policies and with that messaging, especially given that, there was such a short time frame for the implementation of these final rules and that they came out in the midst of a global pandemic. So thank you all for, all the work that you've done and for sharing it with us. I did see that we had Raina join us. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you to my colleagues who helped on the technical end. We're so happy to have you here today. Would you mind just briefly introducing yourself, and perhaps if you'd like to just let us know if you have anything to add about your own campus policies? I think you're still muted.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Yes, I'm glad I was able to make it in also. That was hair raising. My name is Raina Dighton White. I see that a lot of you on here, I know through the Connecticut Title IX Association and other professional events, but I'm the University of St. Joseph's Title IX coordinator. I was previously a Title IX coordinator for the University of Hartford, and prior to that, I worked in a lot of public service positions. I was a project manager for the VAWA federal grant funds with the Office of Policy and Management with the state of Connecticut. I was a hearing officer for the city of Hartford. I contracted with the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services, working with a program to help bridge inequities around racial disparities in recovery assistance and recovery professionals. And I was a criminal defense attorney. So I did a lot of work kind of before and around Title IX before I got to it, but mainly I managed the VAWA grant funds and got to really know Connecticut Alliance as well as CCADV and work with them on a very close level, and was very happy that I was able to continue my work in education, which is a field that I've always enjoyed and have a very deep connection to. Most people in my family do teach or are attorneys. So the opportunity to be both, I work in education and have a law degree has just been wonderful for me. I definitely do work that is difficult. Most people probably aren't smiling and thinking to myself, oh gosh, criminal defense attorney and all those other things. But I help people through difficult circumstances, no matter what side they fall on. And with regards to policies that we've enacted, I think most of you, Ebony and I have sat on a panel previously, we've all kind of mirrored the same approach. And that really is this, as I pretty much told my campus. The process may have changed, the name may have changed, but the expectations have not. So, University of St. Joseph is a Roman Catholic school. It was founded by a set of nuns, and they do have very traditional behavior expectations. And what we've done is simply what most of you have all stated: move them under other processes. And one of the things you guys were talking about were kind of, how do you explain this to students? How do you explain this to employees? One of the things we try to do at the outset, even if it's my office that's contacted, is I don't ever promise someone that something is or isn't Title IX. And I've tried not to do that in the past as well. What I have said is, you know what, that's definitely something that we need to look into. And I usually try to, no matter what land we're in, if someone's contacting your office and they're hurt, they're upset, they're angry, they're in any sort of emotional state outside of calm, I usually try to address them first as a human being, right? Ultimately, they probably don't care what the process is. They care about redemption. So what we always try to do first is give them redemption as a person, and recognizing that no matter where this falls, whether or not this even goes through a disciplinary process of some sort or the other, how are you? How are you feeling? How can I help you as a person? Usually I find that if I engage in that approach first, no matter what it is that I have to tell somebody afterwards, they know that I didn't just treat them like a piece of paper or a case or some type of widget that I just put through a machine and said, poof, here's the answer, what's next? So that's kind of been my approach, right? Because no matter what, the federal government, thankfully, has never really impeded on our ability or right to accommodate. When I was reading through these things, and I'll tell you, it was not easy reading, not easy reading. Oh, it was a rough summer. And as someone who comes from a law school that put a lot of heavy stress on kind of like the Constitution and civil rights and that type of stuff, that was a long read. But one of the things that I was at least able to walk away with was, oh, okay, they haven't touched our right and our our discretion around accommodations, you know. So you're right. When you know, Ebony, as you mentioned, when you talk about sending those letters, when you talk about having to sit someone down and say, you know what, I'm sorry, but for whatever reason, we're not bringing this person through Title IX, through discipline, through whatever. You know, I always tell the person, you know, you're not off or you're not wrong or there's not an issue with how you feel. Just because these set of rules don't line up with the ability to hold someone accountable doesn't mean that your experience still wasn't difficult, you know, and upsetting. You know, I try to never take that away from the person, even if it's sometimes for things that, you know, are very, very minor, you know. You always give that to someone first. So that's what I add. That's what I would add. And yes, everything after that really is for us internally. So usually I've tried to keep my conduct director by my side. I kind of told him we're twins now, where I go, you go, because things that might have fallen on my desk before are now going to land on yours. And we even try to present and work as a team to the students so that they kind of understand it doesn't really matter what I do. One way or another, this person or this person are going to show up, and it looks like they work together quite a bit. So, you know, if I engage in behavior that falls outside of our community expectations because I think or believe a rule has changed, it has not. And I do the same thing with our HR director. She's also a deputy. So it's an easier message to put forward to adults, they get it. But we really do try to physically march it out to students. And from what I've found, the message has been well received. They know that we pretty much work as a team, right? And we tell our students that. They're not supposed to be process professionals, right? They're supposed to be people. And no matter where a complaint lands, we all try to engage in the same human first response. And then we figure out whatever the process is on the back end as we discuss it back and forth and see where the elements lie. And I don't know if this was discussed, but at the end of our student code of conduct, we included a few years back a civility code. So it kind of works as a nice catch-all. And that's what I mean around the behave part, right? I tell folks, you know, don't engage in behavior that you know falls outside of our expectations, you know, the culture of the campus. That civility catch-all clause has been very helpful over the last few years, especially given our social political climate. That's it.
Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for sharing all of that important information. So I do want to ensure that we have time for some audience Q&A today. So I think I will open it up to audience Q&A before moving on to my last question that I want to ask folks. So to my colleagues, are there any questions from the audience for our panel here today? Sure. So we have one question from the audience for our panelists. I understand that campus disclosures are going to be down because of COVID. However, is there a way to know if disclosures are down because of COVID isolation or for other reasons, such as surveys, et cetera?
I think that they'll definitely go down for the disclosures, but I still, as an academic advisor, in fact, I have to leave in a couple minutes just because I have a student coming, but students are still disclosing to us because we still have that one-on-one conversation. So I don't know how much it's going to go down within the community colleges as long as advisors are prepared to like ask the questions of, you know, have you gotten any assistance? Do you know where to get support? So they might be down a little bit, but I think, especially in my case, I'm seeing so many students right now for advising, you know, how are things going? The only thing I do fear is that they might not disclose because their abuser might be in the room with them. So I'm hoping that students find some way to communicate. I know we have the texting that available to them, and just make sure that they're still getting the support. And so I'm having the new Title IX coordinator send out a lot of general information, so it's not really specific. And I think even through doing the Not Anymore program, students are always contacting us saying, well, I already took this. At least it engages us in a conversation that we can reach students continually. So, and I do need to apologize. I do have a student waiting for me in my other chat room. So thank you so much for having me today.
Of course, thank you so much for joining us and for that input. We really appreciate it.
There are surveys, and we actually conducted our survey right before COVID. And had we known, right, had we known that we were going to be in a pandemic, we probably would have waited. So we probably won't have another survey for a couple of years. But what we're seeing, as I said before, is a lot of our students are utilizing our confidential advocates, which is great. And we have peer educators who are very invested. We have a group called Safety Net, and they have a subcommittee around policies and procedures. And they are actually going to hold a town forum, a virtual town forum next week. And we've been putting on a lot of programming around Title IX, and we've ramped up our like Green Dot training and our bystander intervention, and we are visible, even though, and we're doing this dance, right? Because we know everyone is exhausted. We know that this shift in academics and how in virtual learning, their classes are all times of nights now, and so our students are exhausted. So we're doing this dance of how much information, we don't want to inundate them, we overwhelm them because they're already overwhelmed. I think everyone in 2020 is just overwhelmed and exhausted and tired. But we still know that this is important information. So we're doing this dance, but we are putting the information out there so that they know that even though, it looks different, your schooling looks different, we're still here. And if anything is happening, we want to help. And we know that our students are also in different states, and so there are laws there that are different from Connecticut. And so I had our director of SVPA put together a package. So here are the resources in your particular state. This is what you can do in your state if we can't help you here. So we've just ramped up a lot of outreach and community services and programming, just so they know we are still here if you need us. And they are, like I said, utilizing our confidential advocates, which is great because I know that they're talking to someone, and hopefully eventually it'll get to me. So yeah, that's what we're doing here on campus.
Great, thank you so much for that input. We do have a couple more questions I've gotten directly. So I had a question, which is what penalties look like through Title IX versus through broader misconduct policies, if there's a difference in the kind of penalties that are written into those policies.
Actually, I'd like to answer that if you don't mind. It's actually been long established by several groups, ATICSA, NACUA, that you want to be very careful about having separate penalties for Title IX than for your regular conduct, be it for your employees or your students. And if you look at the range of penalties for students or employees, both of them at the extreme end result in expulsion from the institution. Be it being you're fired or you're expelled. And when a person is expelled, usually there's a notation regarding FAFSA as well as some other financial aid matters. So that follows an individual. New regulations as well as new NCAA regulations have started to become imposed around, in fact, making certain notations on a student's record. So for people who are concerned that, oh, if I'm going through one process or another, that it's going to result in a different disciplinary outcome, that's actually never been the case. even before, when behavior that walked the line, but ultimately fell outside of the Title IX policy and still went through student conduct, you always had the same set of disciplinary measures. I do think what happened over, let's say, since about 2014, when all the new regulations were introduced, is that universities, I do think on the lower end, started to expand what some of their disciplinary measures were, or what some of their remedies were. But they never, I don't think any school has gotten rid of, being removed from housing permanently, suspension for semesters, as well as expulsion. But what you have seen is an attempt to, on the bottom end of it, expand remedies for behavior that we know are unhealthy, but might not quite fall into sexual misconduct. But you keep those processes the same for employees as well. Sorry, you keep the discipline the same,
Great.
but the
Thank you
process.
for answering.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. Did anybody have any other input before I jump into the next question? Okay. So we have a question as well. How are campuses dealing with assisting the two parties with finding an attorney if resources are an issue? We will hear from the Victims' Rights Center of Connecticut, but what are other options for either party?
The advisors? Is
Yes.
that- okay. So we have, we put a call out to our campus for volunteers to be advisors. And even though the regs say they don't have to be trained, we're going to train our advisors. So we're training a group of advisors, but we also partner with the Victims' Rights Law Center, who are attorneys who will do this work pro bono. And then we're looking into sort of the same for respondents as well. So we want to make sure that it's equitable. If someone has an attorney, then and the other person, they don't want their professor, even though they've been trained, it's understandable. And so we want to be able to offer them resources. So we're partnering with outside agencies for that.
I'll just jump in for UConn as well. Similar to what Ebony said, we've got advisors who we've identified and trained in that role, and regarding the procedures and what to expect and what that role would entail, going through the procedures. But certainly before we get to the university assigning advisors, we're making sure that our students are connected with all of the resources that we've talked about, so they can, if they have an advocate that they want to work with, they're well connected with those resources, so they can make that selection on their own. But yeah, we do have a panel of folks who are going to be available and ready to assist as needed.
Great, thank you so much for sharing more information. And like I said, we will be hearing from Maura soon, who is from the RCCT and can share more information about what some legal options look like for folks. I wanted to ask as well, if you could leave survivors of sexual violence with any advice, supportive remarks, or other information today, what would you like to share?
There's nothing about these rules or anything that was written down that changes what you went through. Let's be very clear. The ability to gather someone's statement or what somebody said or what could be corroborated does not by any means diminish what your experience was in that moment. It is yours. And don't ever let any of these processes take that away from you. And for those reasons, please remember, no matter what it is that you want to do, universities really do have a responsibility around accommodations. Please always seek out those resources. And for those reasons, remember, we also don't have time limits on reporting. It's really your experience and it's your process. We're just here to try to support you in whatever way we can.
Yeah, I think Raina captured that really, really nicely. The only thing I would add to that is we've put a lot of information out on our websites about policy and procedures and resources. So don't hesitate to reach out. I know it's a lot of information out there. Don't hesitate to reach out just to ask questions, to seek support. We want to hear from you. We want to help you. Help is available. And as we said all along, the supports haven't changed. So don't hesitate to reach out.
I echo both Sarah and Raina.
Thank you so much. We do have a couple of more questions. We are running low on time, but just for a couple of minutes, if you could address how you manage social media related to a case when there's a lot of social media involved in a case, what steps you take to manage that, which I imagine is especially relevant, given remote learning.
That can be difficult, but again, the other aspect of our student code of conduct around civility and social media use, if it's being used to harass or disparage or discourage, right, action on either side can come into play. And I oftentimes make that very clear to students. Please don't find yourself in my office simply because you wanted to say something, and you weren't involved in any way, shape, or form otherwise, because it's still sexual. It can still be a student conduct issue, and it's still going to fall under sexual misconduct, just not 34 CFR, right? So that's something, again, that civility and social media clause has been very helpful.
The same. We definitely will look at social media. Students will send something to us and they'll say, well, it's my personal page. And it's like, well, you have that you're a College student. And did you use our server? Did you use our internet? This came from, you were on campus doing this. And so we have jurisdiction to look into this. I tell people all the time, same as Raina, like, be very careful with social media because it can come into play. And people will screenshot and so we always say if something happens on social media, usually they have screenshotted. And I just talked with a student yesterday. It's so funny because someone off campus who has nothing to do with our campus saw something and they screenshotted and sent it and said, your student is acting unbecoming of your values. And so I went to the student and said, listen, it's not just people on our campus, it's people off campus. You have to be very careful what you say and what you put out there. And you have that you're a College student and you're in College paraphernalia. So they know, because the student was like, well, how did they know I went to school? Well, because you put it out there. And so now we have to look into it because you're representing the college. And so so it does come into play. It is tricky sometimes because there's, there's freedom of speech and people have the right to say what they want to on their social media. But we tell our employees as well, if you have up there that you are a College employee, then yeah, we're going to look into it. And so we tell people, even I tell my staff and my people in my division, take College off of your social media. And then you can say whatever you want to say, but still people, if they know you work for us, will still send it my way, so you have to be very careful.
Yeah, we've been able to sometimes hold folks accountable because they're in full paraphernalia, especially athletes. They're taking photos and then posting things and you can see it in their gallery. So for anybody out there, one of the ways from a policy standpoint, again, is marketing coming in and going, yeah, but you've got our logo on here while you're stating this. So we do have a right. And again, that then allows the employee the employee code or the student code of conduct to come in again. And again, that's what we mean around having the same disciplinary measures, no matter what as you all can see, especially with these new rules, we've all had to kind of branch out into other ways to get remedies in place for behaviors that we all know have long been discouraged in work and school environments. So yeah, always look to see if your logo's in there, because that can be helpful sometimes for saying, no, you can't do it.
For sure. Thank you so much for answering that question and for all of the information that you've shared with us today. We will be wrapping it up, but I'd like to thank our panelists so much for their remarks, all that you've shared with us today, and of course, all of the critical support that you're providing to your campus communities. So next up, we'll be hearing from Maura Crossan, who is the director of the Victims' Rights Center of Connecticut, to learn more about the support that VRCCT can provide to survivors of sexual violence. Maura is an amazing advocate and leader, and as her colleague, I'm thankful for her hard work, to have VRCCT as a program of the Alliance, and of course, to have her here today. So welcome, Maura.
Thank you so much, Bridget. I really appreciate your kind words. I'm going to share my screen for my presentation. Hopefully that works. So good morning, still morning, everyone. As Bridget mentioned, my name is Maura Crossan. I'm the Senior Attorney and Program Director for the Victim Rights Center of Connecticut, which is a program of the Connecticut Alliance to End Sexual Violence. I am grateful to have been asked to present today to you about the services that we provide at the Victim Rights Center. I also really wanted to thank our last panelists, Raina, Jessica, Sarah, and Ebony, some of whom I have met virtually, some of whom I haven't worked with yet, but I look forward to continued collaborations with your offices and your colleagues. So the Victim Rights Center of Connecticut, or VRCCT, as I'll refer to it, was acquired by the Alliance in 2018. I have been with the program. I actually just celebrated my 5-year anniversary with the Victim Rights Center. And I've been with the Alliance since 2018. I received my bachelor's degree from UConn and received my law degree from Quinnipiac. So I am a Connecticut girl through and through. And I am excited to be here today and welcome any questions or feedback, or like I said, collaboration in the future about my program and how we can help your students. So for those of you who may not know, we were founded in 2013. We're the only program in Connecticut exclusively serving the legal needs of victims of violent crime. Our team, which I'm very proud of, we currently have a staff of 6 associate attorneys, 2 of which are bilingual, Spanish-speaking attorneys. We also have 1 bilingual case manager and paralegal. This semester, we were thrilled to have 2 certified legal interns from Quinnipiac Law School. We hope to be we are welcoming another 2 next semester, hoping still to welcome a 3rd as well to our team. So we have grown over the years for those who have maybe followed us. Our current catchment area is New Haven County, Middlesex County, Hartford County, Tolland County, Windham County, and parts of Fairfield County, which is the greater Bridgeport area. So obviously you can see we aren't currently practicing statewide. That is certainly a future goal of the program. When we started, it was 1 attorney who started our program in 2013. And so over the years, we have grown and expanded our catchment area, and we do hope to expand to be statewide as soon as we can. So if you're working at or with a school or a student of a school that may not be in that catchment area, please still know that we are available as a resource. Connecticut is a small bar, so we may know someone within our own legal network that may be able to provide services to a victim if it's in an area which we don't currently practice. So specifically, VRCCT provides trauma-informed, holistic legal services to victims of sexual assault, stalking, child abuse, LGBTQ IA, and plus hate crimes, elder abuse, student sexual harassment, and homicide. We do not charge for our services regardless of income. Today, I'm only going to be presenting about how we assist in Title IX cases, but I did just want to give an overview for those of you that are part of this roundtable who may not know the other services that VRCCD does provide. That's pre and post arrest advocacy, family and civil protective orders, education, Title IX, which we'll be talking about today, housing, immigration, and employment. So again, we try and provide as many wraparound holistic legal services as we can. We get this question a lot. Why should victims have a lawyer? Well, victims have been through very traumatizing experiences that often impact multiple areas of their lives. And those of you who work, especially in higher ed, you may have a student who was sexually assaulted, whose education is not only impacted, but also their housing may be impacted, their employment may be impacted. If it's a family dynamic, there may be some ways that other areas may be impacted in other ways that we can assist. Pro se representation, which means people who don't have lawyers, who are immersed in the civil, legal, or criminal justice system, can be really overwhelming or re-traumatizing. So not all of the people that they may come in contact with are necessarily trauma informed within the system. And so navigating it pro se can be very overwhelming. Our attorneys are trained in trauma-informed legal practice, and that's not something that you're necessarily taught in law school. That's not something I came out of law school or after taking the bar, I completely understood how to be a trauma-informed lawyer. That's something that I've had to spend many, many years in my practice really honing that skill and ability to be a trauma-informed lawyer. So we can assist victims in navigating the complex legal system. So every system is different, and even different parts within those systems can be different. So the way that the University of Connecticut handles, for example, a Title IX complaint can look very different than how even Yale handles a Title IX complaint. And so and both of those systems might be complex. And so having a lawyer to assist in navigating the complex systems can be very helpful for the victim in hopefully obtaining some form of what they consider to be justice. So I think most importantly, attorneys can lay out all of the legal options as they arise. We really strive to advise and empower victims to choose their own path to justice and recovery. We understand that what justice looks like to one student or one survivor may not look the same to another at all. And so it's our job to not only advise, but empower them to make the decision that's right for that student, for that survivor. And we are not judgmental about whatever that path is, whatever that outcome that they're seeking might be. And that's all part of being a trauma-informed lawyer. So specifically, how can lawyers assist victims in Title IX cases? I know we've talked a lot today already. I've been on the roundtable since 9:30 as well. So I didn't want to get bogged down in sort of the nitty gritty of Title IX. I just wanted to give a brief overview to you all, though I'm sure many of you are already familiar. And so again, I won't spend time on this, but just wanted to also highlight, I know today we're spending a lot of time talking about Title IX in the higher education forum, but it also applies to all schools who are receiving federal funding. So that's K through 12 and high school. We have handled several Title IX cases in those forums as well. So again, we have talked about this a bit today, but just the real basics of Title IX and the things that are required of institutions under Title IX: a notice of non-discrimination, a Title IX coordinator, an outlined grievance procedure, and schools to be prompt in investigating and adjudicating complaints. And for additional resources, we recommend knowyour9.org. So how can VRCCT lawyers help? And how may we be able to help differently than other support services or advisors? So I think first and foremost, it's important that to note that we can assess the option of reporting by filing a complaint. So not all of our cases are referred to us after a complaint has been filed. And filing a complaint, as in filing a complaint in any criminal justice or civil legal administrative forum, carries consequences. And so we're able to, again, advise and empower victims to make a choice that's right for them. One of the first things that we do when we get a referral from an institution, whether we've worked with that institution or not, we first and foremost look up their grievance procedure and their policies, and we make sure that we are advising the student on what those procedures and the policies look like. And I think we can also speak to the client and advise based on our own experience with the institution and other cases that we've handled, and really allow the victim to make an informed decision on whether or not they even want to go through with the reporting process. If the victim chooses to report, we can connect the victim to and collaborate with supportive resources. We love a collaborative model, a multidisciplinary approach. And so we always encourage our clients to sign releases of information that allow us to work with different support resources, referral sources, program partners in this work. We can then act as a liaison to the Title IX office as official advisor of the student. So it's sort of a buffer between the Title IX office and the student. I've had many students just say that getting an email about the case can really trigger them. And if they're having a good day, or if they're in the middle of studying for a test, or just trying to live their life as a student and a human, they can be really triggered by receiving an email or a notice or an update about their case, or the opposite, not receiving any information can be sometimes really harmful to the victim's recovery and healing. And so having a person act as a go-between and a buffer between the office and the student can be really helpful. We can ensure that proper protocol is followed. Again, a lot of the schools we work with are doing an excellent job, and certainly, the 4 Title IX coordinators that we heard from, seem to have the victims and students who are making these complaints, their interests really at heart. And that's so encouraging for me to have heard. That's not true at every institution. And so we want to make sure that we are holding that institution accountable. We can assist with drafting the complaint and any other paperwork that's required for the process. We can review and advise on no contact orders and ensure safety plans are victim-centered. We can assist in amending complaints for retaliation and violations of the no contact order. We can assist in obtaining accommodations for a student to allow them to continue their education. I think it was so important to have heard again from the last 4 speakers. I think each one of you used the word accommodations multiple times in your responses. And again, that was something so encouraging to hear as an advocate and an attorney in these types of cases. Accommodations can be key to the ability to the survivor to navigate the complaint, but also just navigate their life during the process following an assault. We can assist with preparation for the interview with the fact finder, help a victim to gather their thoughts. We can advise on what documents and/or evidence should be submitted. We can help to prepare for a hearing if a hearing is part of the procedure. We can attend proceedings actually physically with the victim or virtually, as some of them are now this year, or most of them have been this year. We can help victims appeal unfavorable decisions after a hearing. And also we can file complaints with the Office of Civil Rights, or OCR, when Title IX rights are violated. So how can providers or advocates make a referral to the Victim Rights Center? Here is our referral form. It can be sent to Providers, if you want a copy of our referral form, you can request a copy of it at vrcctreferrals@endsexualviolencect.org, which is the email you see on your screen. Referral forms can be faxed to the number you see, or referrals can be made verbally over the phone. Referrals can also be made by, self-referrals can be made by students themselves. We don't want the referral form or lack of access to a computer or a fax machine or anything else to be a barrier to service. So certainly we take self-referrals or referrals by providers over the phone. The form is certainly helpful to us to have as much information as possible. It outlines also a lot of our policies and procedures in the top portion there that you see, so that we're ensuring not only is the referral source not wasting their time or the victim's time, but also the resources of our program if it's something that we simply can't help with, or it's outside of our catchment area. So the top of the referral form is important because it does outline those things to follow. So with that, I know we are low on time, but I will certainly open it back up to Bridget and any questions that have been posed.
I'm not seeing any questions on my end. Have any of my colleagues received any questions from folks? All right, so we have a question. During COVID, will VRCCT accept a referral form that is not signed by the client?
Absolutely. The referral form is simply a way to get us information, and certainly we will have the client sign the necessary documents in order to retain us, and any releases of information afterwards. So the referral form signature does not make or break whether we would take a referral.
All right, I'm not seeing any other questions. Thank you so much, Maura, for being here today and providing all the information that you have.
Of course, thank you. If anyone wants to reach out directly, if they have other questions, I put the contact information here for the Victim Rights Center, our general email, our emails again for referrals. And if anyone is interested or a student is interested in an internship opportunity, also the email for Nadia to contact to discuss that opportunity. I'm really grateful to have had the opportunity to present to you today. Thank you, Bridget, for putting together an amazing roundtable.
Of course, and we actually did get one more last minute question, if you wouldn't mind.
Not at all.
Are there any other resources that would offer the service if your attorneys are full?
So again, it's something that you'd probably want to contact us. It may be, it's going to be dependent on the area that the institution is located in, and people within our own legal network that we might be able to connect them to. There's no other organizations in Connecticut that I'm aware of that are doing this work.
All right. Thank you again so much, Maura.
Of course.
All right. So next up, we have Kara Mackler. She's a campus advocate from the Women's Center of Greater Danbury, and she'll be sharing more information about the advocacy services our 9 member centers can provide to college and university campuses. Kara is a creative, engaged, empathetic, and hardworking advocate who provides such a valuable service to the folks that she works with over at the Western Connecticut State University. So welcome, Kara.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for that kind and warm introduction. It's so nice to see so many people on the call today, and particularly a lot of our colleagues I see. So thank you for having me. Thank you for organizing this. And I'm going to share my screen for anyone else who's a visual learner like me can see the services that we provide. So I'm just going to make sure it's full screen. So just as an introduction to the Women's Center in general, and then I will speak on the services we provide on campus. We are a dual agency, so we provide both domestic violence and sexual assault services in addition to resource services in the northern Fairfield and southern Litchfield County areas of Connecticut. So we are a member agency of both the Alliance and the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence, which are the maps on the right of the screen. All of our services are free and confidential to people of all identities. So despite our name, we serve people of all gender identities in those areas. So our services in general at the Women's Center are listed here. And these are just some of the things covering kind of what we provide in our communities. So individual and group counseling, crisis intervention and safety planning, advocacy in multiple different kind of capacities and entities. So that can be with the hospital accompaniment or working with police departments or law enforcement. We do have also court advocates or family violence victim advocates at the Danbury Superior Court that can assist with TROs and custody cases, et cetera. We also, of course, work on campus at WCSU, so Western Connecticut State University. And we also have the Danbury campus of Naugatuck Valley Community College that we can serve. They're actually right across the street from our main office in Danbury. So I'll talk more about the services that we provide on campus in the next few slides. So in addition to our direct service work, we also provide education, training, and outreach, which is mainly the work that I provide at the Women's Center, particularly on the college campuses. And then we also have our emergency residential facility. We provide referrals. So we've worked with many of the different folks that have been on the call today in their different offices and such. And then of course we have our 2 24/7 hotlines that are available. So that's just kind of a snapshot of the services that we provide across the agency. But speaking specifically about the services that we provide on campus, so we have an MOU with Western Connecticut State University. We've been working with them for a number of years and have been able to provide, they have been able to provide a space for us on campus. So we actually have a satellite office on the Midtown campus at WCSU where we can provide our services to students there. Currently, and since pretty much the beginning of the pandemic, everything has been remote. So we're offering virtual services in place of our typical in-person services. And so what those look like are under our direct service, we provide the counseling, individual counseling and group counseling. We've been able to provide some virtual support groups during the pandemic, in addition to providing our individual counseling virtually as well. And then of course we provide advocacy services. So in addition to, of course, hospital accompaniment and police accompaniment, we work with the campus police as well. We work very closely with the Title IX office and Title IX coordinator at WCSU, in addition to judicial affairs and the director of judicial affairs there. And so in our individual advocacy, we can work with survivors directly on their needs, what they're looking for, lay out their options, let them know what their rights are, and let them decide, of course, what feels best for them. And we can walk them through that process. We can contact offices on behalf of them or just accompany them to those different spaces and let them know what their rights are in those different spaces, in addition to providing that emotional support and safety planning if they need it. Outside of our individual advocacy that we do with clients and survivors, we also provide kind of campus-wide advocacy. So there's 2 of us kind of full-time on campus that we provide the education, direct service, et cetera. And so there's been a lot of conversations with the Title IX coordinator, judicial affairs director on ensuring trauma-informed language in the forms that many of our previous panelists have discussed about the letters that go out to survivors, complainants, or respondents when there's a hearing coming up and things like that, in addition to any of the forms that survivors have to fill out to ensure that it's trauma-informed, that the language makes sense, and that students know what their rights are. So we work really collaboratively with all of those offices, in addition to the fact that we have seats on the campus response and resource team at WCSU. So our CART team at WCSU meets monthly, and so we're able to attend all of those meetings and play a role in that team to advocate for survivors campus-wide. And then of course we work with all the different offices in student affairs. So we've worked with the Choices office that helps with substance use and abuse on campus, in addition to clubs and organizations and Greek life, athletics, So we collaborate and partner with many of the different offices on campus in terms of advocating for survivors and in terms of our education and our outreach. So that is kind of mainly what I focus on, is the education, training, and outreach, particularly at WCSU, but like I said, at NVCC as well. And so what that looks like, and I'm going to show a few pictures in a little bit too, because we miss our students, we miss being on campus with them. So just to give an idea of kind of what we typically do and when the pandemic is not happening. So our education programs, we offer to anyone. So that can be in classrooms. I've worked with nursing students and kind of tailor the programs to the audience that we're working with. So we have a program for nursing students that specifically targets kind of how to identify a patient who might be experiencing or has experienced interpersonal violence. Similarly for business students, of talking about sexual harassment in the workplace. And then we have programs tailored for our athletics. We do bystander intervention programs as well, kind of focused on the leaders on campus, student leaders, including Greek life as well. We also provide programs in the residence halls for the residents, the students, in addition to the training for the RAs and the ARMs. So in assisting them to respond sensitively to disclosures of interpersonal violence. So in addition to the RA and ARM trainings, we provide staff and faculty trainings kind of across the board. I work in conjunction with the Title IX coordinator to provide dozens of trainings to all of the previous and current faculty that have to receive the diversity trainings, and they combine them with our training as well, which covers interpersonal violence. So we provide those each year, in addition to the judicial board training that is provided annually. So for those who sit on the board during the hearings of sexual misconduct cases, being able to look through a trauma-informed lens and speak through a trauma-informed lens as those board members. So those are some of the staff and faculty trainings that we provide as well. And then of course we provide outreach. So that can include a lot of our awareness events. So again, typically in person, we would be doing our clothesline project. And these will all have pictures in the next few slides. The Red Flag campaign, Silent Witness exhibit, Love is Sweet, which is an event we started in the last couple of years and had a lot of student volunteers help us out. And they seem to really enjoy those events. So these are just some of the events that we provide, typically again, in person on campus. So obviously, as everyone has had to, we have adapted to the virtual environment and have been able to provide virtual programs, awareness events, and we even started a weekly video series called Real Talk, where we discuss topics related to relationships, empathy, advocacy, and life in a semi-casual format that is meant to really speak to the college population about issues that are hopefully very relevant to them. So next, I'm just going to show some pictures. Again, this is more for me selfishly because I miss our students. So just to walk through some of the events that we provide and things that students have connected with. So some of the pictures here are showing the Silent Witness exhibit. So those represent the victims across our county, and particularly Connecticut, who have died due to acts of dating and domestic violence. Students really find that event to be powerful. We've received many clients as a result of hosting that event. Students who will read the stories and say, wow, that could have been me, or that could have been my family member. And wanting to reach out for support and help or counseling to process what might come up for them. In addition to our Love is Sweet event, so we have lollipops that we give out on Valentine's Day with our contact information and prompts related to healthy relationships and things of that nature, in addition to our bracelets and pens and stuff like that. On this slide here, we have the Red Flag campaign, in addition to our attendance at Fresh Check Day, which is where all freshman students, and really all students, but it's targeted for freshmen, can walk around to different tables with a passport and learn about the different resources on campus. So we typically have a large kind of flip chart where students can write a message to survivors, and then we hang those up in our office for our clients to be able to see. We also have the Step Up campaign where students can provide messages of support to survivors, and we post or plant them in the ground on display, in addition to the Red Flag campaign, which highlights warning signs for abusive relationships and students were really eager to participate in that and start those conversations as well. We also work with the It's On Us Club at WCSU. We all serve as the advisor for that club. And they have worked to provide many different events, an art gallery, which was incredibly successful. They also help with Take Back the Night in conjunction with a sorority on campus that kind of hosts it and organizes it. So we're able to work in collaboration with many of those clubs and organizations to provide different events in addition to the ones that we provide ourselves. And then this last kind of collage here are of the education programs and trainings that we've provided in the past. I really miss being in person with these people. It's so much more fun and engaging than doing these over Zoom. So these pictures make me sad, but hopefully we'll get back to this soon. But yeah, so some of these pictures are with the different athletic teams. So we provided the Bringing in the Bystander program to every single athletic team at WCSU a couple of years ago, and have been able to upkeep with that in the past couple of years, providing bystander intervention trainings and programs. We've kind of worked with the Dean of Students to provide, collaborate with the Choices Office and Judicial Affairs to provide a program called the Delivery of Programs, where we provide these trainings essentially targeted towards student leaders on campus. And so that includes athletes, Greek life, rec staff, RAs and ARMs, et cetera. So pretty much any student leader group or club on campus, we've been able to provide these programs to inform them of our services, but also to educate them on the dynamics of interpersonal violence, how to support a friend and a peer and things like that. So after each of our education programs, we provide an evaluation. It's anonymous to every single student that has received the education program. And it can be on the number of different topics, like I mentioned before. So it can be anything from sexual harassment, healthy relationships and dating abuse, consent and sexual assault, bystander intervention, technology, and as it relates to interpersonal violence. So there's a number of different topics they may receive. But the evaluation is standard. And in each evaluation, we give students the option to either self-identify as a victim or survivor of interpersonal violence, or to note if they know someone who's experienced it. And what we found is that 80% of students, and this is out of hundreds of students who took the evaluation in the last year, that 80% of students know someone who has experienced a form of interpersonal violence, and that 51% of students have experienced a form of interpersonal violence themselves. So obviously these numbers are pretty staggering. For anyone who knows the campus at WCSU, it's about 5,000 students on average. And we obviously don't reach all of those students in our programs, but we reach quite a few. We're pretty high number of students that we reach in our programs and our trainings. And so we know that this number is high, but it seems about right in terms of what we're seeing. And it also shows us that the education programs are a way to connect with those victims and survivors. A lot of students don't know that we exist until we come into the classrooms. We've been a lot more visible in the last few years, which has been fantastic, but particularly for those freshman students that we know are particularly vulnerable, we want to make sure that they know that we're a resource to them. There's also a portion of the evaluation where they will self-disclose kind of their knowledge level prior to the training or program and then after the program. And so there has been a notable increase in their knowledge that they self-identified. That shows us that, obviously it's a protective factor to prevent further victimization. The more knowledge is power, right? We like to say at the Women's Center all the time, our CEO, Pat, mentions that an informed community is a safer community. So the more knowledge, the better. But also we know that students often refer other students to us. So sometimes it will be a friend saying, hey, I heard of this place called the Women's Center on campus. I think they can help you with what you're going through. And so a lot of times that word of mouth, not only of the knowledge of the issues, but the knowledge of us existing as a resource on campus is proven to be connected to our education programs and just our general outreach and being visible on campus, which of course, as you can imagine during the pandemic has been challenging. So we really amped up our social media presence to try to stay connected to students virtually. So this is just a quote from a nursing student that provided that they provided in their evaluation, saying, "I thought the presentation was very powerful and educational. I feel every college student should have this presentation. It was very moving and eye-opening." So obviously we always ask for feedback from our students, from our colleagues. We want to make sure the topics are relevant. We want to make sure the messaging is getting across and see any ways that we can improve. And students really are receptive to this information. And this oftentimes results in more clients coming in as a result of, I was sitting in that class listening to healthy relationships and dating abuse, and it hit me that that happened to me. And now they're coming in for counseling. So the relationship between our departments in terms of education and training and our direct service are completely linked and overlapped due to this. So that kind of wraps up my presentation, but I did want to leave you all with our contact information. So we have our campus office phone, which even though we're not physically in the office, we can still receive those calls and voicemails and connect with people through that phone number, in addition to our hotlines, which are available 24/7, like I mentioned before. If you don't already, please follow us on Instagram. So we have our own campus account because of the unique population that we create content, particularly for the college population that we serve. So feel free to give us a follow and see what we're up to on there. We also have our Real Talk videos and things like that on our IGTV on Instagram. And if you have any questions about kind of the services we can provide or education and training and things of that nature, you can contact myself. And so again, my name is Kara Mackler, and I'm the manager of Campus Education, Training and Outreach, and the Legislative Liaison at the Women's Center. So I will stop my share and see if anyone, kind of hand it back to Bridget, see if anyone has any questions.
Thank you again so much, Kara. I don't see any questions in the chat, but I just want to open it up. If anybody does have any questions they'd like to ask, you just have a few seconds to add something. And I'd just like to thank you again, Kara, for all the work that you and our campus advocates do to provide support to survivors. As we mentioned at the top of this program, we have campus advocates, at all of our member centers statewide. So we have a lot of folks that are doing work like Kara's at each of these member centers. So definitely, if you have any questions about your own college campus and what services are available, you could definitely reach out to your local center. If you're not sure where that is, you could definitely contact me and I would be happy to connect you to the advocate. All right, still not seeing any questions. I think we're all good, but thank you again so much, Kara, for presenting today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And you're always an incredible, wonderful support. So thank you for all the work that you do in general. And thank you for setting up this event. It was fantastic.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. All right. So before we wrap up today, I just want to provide more information about another resource that's available to our campus partners and advocates, which is the Connecticut College Consortium to End Sexual Violence. So I will share my own screen for a brief presentation on that. So the consortium is a group that is comprised of representatives from Connecticut colleges and universities, sexual assault crisis advocates, and any other community partners who are dedicated to ending sexual violence on college and university campuses. The consortium is a space to share information, strategies, and resources in order to strengthen and support our collective goal to end sexual violence. Members have the opportunity to collaborate with colleagues statewide and have special access to different programming and resources. This is a group that is coordinated by the Connecticut Alliance to End Sexual Violence, and my position was actually created last year in part to organize the consortium. So while the consortium has historically always been a great resource to campus communities, I've dedicated a great deal of time and effort over the last several months to create some plans to further bolster the consortium. I am very excited to get that started at the beginning of 2021, and I would like to share more information about what the consortium will look like for anybody who might be interested. So a little bit about what consortium membership would include. We would include ongoing networking and collaboration with campus partners and advocates statewide. We would have spaces for resource sharing, as well as an exclusive newsletter that would go out to our members. Members would have special accessing to programming and resources from the Alliance. Of course, as always, historically, we've had a discount on our public training programs for members, and we'll continue that benefit. But additionally, members could anticipate having early notification of training opportunities. We would create some space and support for student leadership development, as we know that that's something a lot of spaces are seeking. We would also have ongoing updates and information on potential legislation that could impact higher education, as Lucy mentioned much earlier in her panel. We would provide opportunities to collaborate and have meetings with our agency and other legislative and community partners in regards to any of those legislative pursuits. So that's something that we're definitely really excited to get started. And then we, of course, have our quarterly consortium meetings. At these meetings, we will have engagement from Alliance staff. We will have special speakers that will be brought in to discuss different issues in campus anti-sexual violence work. This would be both based on member feedback. So we would have feedback forms to go out as we have in the past to collect information about what our members would hope to see. But then additionally, we will be evaluating some data to see what could be potentially beneficial based on different statewide trends. We also will have meeting agendas and an opportunity to add topics to that agenda for discussion. So if folks are at all interested in getting involved in the consortium, there is an online registration form at the Alliance's website and sexualviolencect.org. You'll see the link there for the consortium specific page. There's more information as well as an opportunity to register right there on the site. You can also feel free to contact me if you have any additional questions or feedback about membership or about the consortium. There will be 2 opportunities a year to register. Our first round of registration will start now and will be going through January. So with that, I want to see if anybody has any questions. I know I just threw a lot of information at you, but all right. So seeing none, we'll move forward in just concluding today's presentation. So before we wrap up, I would just like to point out the link my colleague is going to place in the chat for our evaluation. If you could please just complete that evaluation about our program today, we would really appreciate it. The information you provide, even if you just take a minute or 2, will really help us to continue to create helpful and interesting programming for you in the future. And then lastly, of course, I want to thank our panelists for all that they've shared with us today. Senator Haskell, Elizabeth, Jessica, Ebony, Raina, and Sarah, thank you all so much for providing your expertise. I'd like to thank our presenters, Maura and Kara, both for the work that they do to continue to support survivors in campus communities, as well as for providing information about those resources to us today. I'd like to thank my fellow staff members and colleagues who have helped to make this program possible. Beth, Lucy, Ruth, Jessie, and Elise. This program has definitely been a product of a lot of work and collaboration, and I really appreciate everything that you all have done. And then, of course, thank you to every attendee who has joined us here today. All of you are making efforts and doing absolutely critical work to ensure that survivors continue to be protected and supported. So thank you sincerely for all that you are doing, and thank you for collaborating with us and for sharing space with us today. Please feel free to contact me at any time if there's any training or technical assistance you're seeking at your institution, or if you have any questions at all about the College Consortium. I wish each of you and your loved ones happiness and health through the holidays and into the new year. I will remain on here just for a few minutes. I see there have been a couple of questions in the chat that I'll answer directly, and just give folks a chance to put in anything there that they'd like. We are just under time, which is perfect. But for those of you who are going to sign off, definitely have a great afternoon, and thank you again so much for coming today.